This is starvation yield, and that's what we've got too much of in the world.
When a family is in doubt that they'll have enough to eat, then the leader of that family is highly tempted to take whatever action is necessary to correct the problem or the affliction of the ones he loves. That may be taking up arms and joining in a revolution against the government that controls his life politically, because he tends to blame them for the starvation of his own wife and children.
Today, as during many other times in history, there are grave concerns about food shortages and the unrest caused by famine. The same was true when the birth rate increased after the Second World War, causing predictions that population growth would outstrip food supplies and cause great human suffering. During that period, when the hungry of the world needed a champion, a most unlikely hero emerged. He was not a politician nor power broker, but an American farm boy whose discoveries would save more than 1 billion people from starvation.
Borlaug's professor, Stakeman, was the first to study these airborne things. He would put flypaper on the front of an airplane wing and fly over the Great Plains collecting these spores.
I was offered an opportunity to go to DuPont Chemical Company. A few weeks after I'd signed this contract or been given this job, Pearl Harbor came. And so the laboratory that I was to have worked with on agricultural chemicals was converted into a laboratory for the armed forces.
Borlaug's microbiology lab developed camouflage paint, protective aerosols, and water-purifying chemicals. He also studied the effects of fungal organisms on the deterioration of material in tropical war zones. His family life was blissfully normal, and 2 years later, their daughter, Norma Jean, was born. Margaret and Norman did not know then that they never would spend as much time together again. In November 1939, Franklin Delano Roosevelt won his third election for the presidency. His vice presidential choice was Henry A. Wallace, another son of Iowa, who had been his Secretary of Agriculture. President Roosevelt asked Wallace to attend the inauguration of the new president of Mexico.
They particularly wanted to take Wallace to central Mexico, the oldest part, land that had been cultivated before the Spanish arrived. And he went, he saw, and he was horrified by the kind of agriculture.
Wallace was concerned to find famine conditions so close to home. The vice president-elect returned to Washington, determined to improve the pitiful conditions he had witnessed.
And so he called the Rockefeller Foundation, and he said, I think this is a challenge that you should accept. This program was started, the joint undertaking by the Rockefeller Foundation Mexican government in 1943.
Some of the Mexican fields had been continuously cultivated for 2,000 years without replenishing soil nutrients. Following a revolution early in the 20th century, millions of acres were redistributed from the powerful to peasants, many of whom lacked the skills and tools to farm. Mexicans depended on expensive imported corn and wheat to survive. The Rockefeller team wanted to bring about a bloodless revolution, one that could conquer hunger and malnutrition with crops fashioned to suit local climate and soils.
I joined that program in '44 and have been involved in international agriculture ever since.
Borlaug spent his first weeks in Mexico working in experimental plots at an agricultural school. He and the program's director, George Harrar, another of Stakeman's protégés, concentrated on wheat, while Edwin Wellhausen specialized in corn. But once they went out into the countryside, their undertaking seemed insurmountable.
There wasn't much of any facility up there in those early days either. It was a kind of an old ramshackle building that you had to use as headquarters and sleeping quarters and everything, because the town didn't amount to anything in the early days either.
He swept out the rats, slept on the floor overnight, nights, and there was a lady next door who had a car, who drove him into town once a week to buy canned food for the week.
Borlaug and Wellhausen became ill from the poor water and food. Racked by dysentery, Borlaug wondered if he had been crazy to give up his comfortable life in Delaware. But what sustained him was his desire to alleviate the greater human misery he saw around every bend in the road. Almost any other professor would have either demanded modern equipment and trained assistants or returned home. In a moment of frustration, Borlaug strapped a rope harness over his own shoulders and pulled a cultivator to prepare soil for planting. He overcame the hardships of his assignment with the determination to find a way to combat hunger by using whatever it would take, be it his brute strength or his brain power. Wheat supplies much of the world's critical dietary protein and carbohydrate nourishment. Second only to maize as the most produced food in the world, wheat, lauded as the staff of life, was first domesticated from wild grasses in the Fertile Crescent about 10,000 years ago. Borlaug decided that if he could increase the yield of wheat, farmers would become enthused and try to use the same techniques. The first urgent problem he tackled was the fungus disease called rust, which Professor Steakman had warned was a shifty, changing, constantly evolving enemy. During Borlaug's first year in Mexico, there was an epidemic of stem rust. He had to search quickly for rust-resistant varieties to save future crops. Borlaug was looking for varieties of wheat that could withstand various diseases, climate zones, and soil conditions. He began collecting samples of wheat from Mexico, imported others from around the world, and launched the tedious work of crossbreeding.
At that time, very few crosses were being made in all of the conventional program. And we made hundreds and soon thousands each year. And that meant that you had a tremendous genetic soup of many combinations. And we selected and discarded ruthlessly.
He planted, waited, and watched for the results. The work was delicate, backbreaking, and exhausting. Nobody on the team worked harder than Borlaug himself. The first crosses were made in 1945, and 2 years later, they had reached 1,500. Borlaug was looking for wheat with resistance to rust, and especially high yield. Many of Borlaug's young associates caught his enthusiasm for crossbreeding wheat. And sooner than anyone predicted, they had new varieties that were completely resistant to rust, a resistance that survived for more than 40 years. Breeding wheat is a time-consuming process. In order to scale up to do thousands of crosses, Borlaug trained local workers. Removing the pollen-producing anthers from one plant and transferring to it the pollen from another plant enables controlled crossbreeding of wheat. Here we see a head of wheat being emasculated several days before it is ready to flower. Carefully, the male anthers are removed, 3 from each flower.
Sacamos tres anteras de cada.
The technician counts the anthers to make sure none are missed. He now has a prepared spike ready for hybridization. The worker protects the spike with a bag until the female organs, which remain, have time to mature. A few days later, a flowering spike is brought from another variety chosen to be the pollen-producing parent of the cross. The flowers are cut open, but it takes several minutes for the pollen to begin to emerge. The top of the protective bag is cut open, and pollen from the selected plant is emptied into the bag and mixed with the original emasculated spike.
Ahí está, ahí se ve. Ahí está el polen.
To protect the pollinated plant, the technician recloses the bag, which prevents any wind-blown pollen from contaminating the cross.
Para que no se vaya.
This guarantees accuracy, and the tag records the data. If the experiment succeeds, the result will be a hybrid wheat with desirable characteristics from both parent plants. Borlaug was impatient. After 5,000 crosses of bread wheat, only 2 were rust-resistant. With just 1 crop each year, he estimated it would take more than 10 years to achieve his goal. He proposed setting up a second agricultural station in the Yaqui Valley, 800 miles north, with seasonal differences that could give them 2 growing seasons a year and double the rate of crossbreeding. But there were obstacles to setting up shop in 2 locations. There weren't even any connecting roads. Borlaug's breakthrough became known as shuttle breeding.
We found different techniques, what we call shuttle breeding, growing in 2 different latitudes, different plantings. So we speeded up everything.
Borlaug transferred the best crosses from each locale to the other, resulting in wheat that was broadly adapted to survive at sea level or in the mountains, in drier as well as wetter conditions. Borlaug had overcome the initial hardships in getting this project off the ground, had bred rust-resistant strains of wheat, and increased the speed of testing new crosses with his innovative shuttle breeding program. But the higher-yielding plants responded so well to irrigation and fertilizer that they grew dangerously tall. And tall wheat has a tendency to lodge or fall over, where it rots before it can be harvested. The challenge was to introduce the gene for shortness from strain B, which Borlaug got from Japan, with the high-yielding but easily lodged strains labeled A. From the first cross of A and B, the plants that look high-yielding but shorter are selected. These selections are then crossed back to the original high-yield strain A, and the selection process is repeated to find plants that are high-yield but shorter. This selection is actually done after these plants are allowed to self-fertilize to make sure that the gene for shortness is carried in the needed form. After repeated crossing and selecting, the gene for shortness in strain B becomes a part of strain A. Starting with nothing, Borlaug had overcome almost insurmountable hardships. The new crossbreeds were higher yielding, resistant to pests and diseases, drought resistant, and regionally adapted to various growing conditions. Borlaug had invented shuttle breeding, conquered rust and lodging. A growing prosperity replaced hunger and poverty in Mexico. Famine on a cataclysmic scale has been predicted for centuries. Strides in medical science drastically reduced death rates, while at the same time, better maternal and infant health care caused the birth rate to rise. As the world's population exploded, doomsayers, led by best-selling author Paul Ehrlich, predicted famine would kill millions. Ehrlich wrote, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate." Borlaug shifted his focus to the hungriest countries on the planet, especially India and Pakistan, where 3 million died from hunger in the 1960s. He joined a team assembled by the United Nations to study agricultural issues, but became frustrated by the resistance to change, even after he demonstrated how his techniques had increased Mexico's production by over 600%.
Remember to select for things that you need in your own country back home, to fit your own situation. Those of you from India and Pakistan where part of your wheat is grown under irrigation, be sure you're selecting the short dwarf plants.
Agricultural trainees from all over the world flocked to the Mexican experimental stations to learn the new technology and returned home with sample seeds to test in their own fields.
This is a plant that's too tall for irrigated conditions of India and Pakistan, but under the dry or semi-dry conditions of Afghanistan is probably what you want.
India requested 10 million tons of wheat from the United States to avoid food shortages. But President Lyndon Johnson resented Mrs. Gandhi's opposition to the Vietnam War and was stingy with aid. To convince aid-dependent countries to become self-sufficient in producing their own food, Borlaug became an unofficial diplomat. Mrs. Gandhi was one of the first leaders to welcome Borlaug's assistance. By 1965, Borlaug and his colleagues had finally won the confidence of political leaders and shipped 250 tons of seed to Pakistan and India.
The fleets of trucks that were carrying the seed from this area of Mexico to Los Angeles were held up and nearly missed the departure for the freighter from Los Angeles because of the Watts racial riots. 3 days after the freighter had left Los Angeles, war was on between Pakistan and India, and both shipments of seed were on the same freighter. To make things even worse, the letter of credit was tangled up and was in disorder, and I told him to ship it and we'd fix this later, and the war was on. So I had a signature on a piece of paper that didn't look very good to many of my administrative superiors.
To avert problems between the two warring countries, the ship was unloaded in Singapore, and the seeds were sent to their final destinations on separate vessels. Half the harvested wheat was used for food. The other half was distributed as seed to farmers. The Green Revolution on the Indian subcontinent was finally underway. Borlaug persevered both politically and scientifically. Soon, India's test fields of dwarf varieties showed promise that its wheat crop could be quadrupled. Pakistan accomplished in 3 years what had taken Mexico 15 years. Both India and Pakistan had increased their yields 7 to 10-fold. The Green Revolution marched forward, and soon Turkey, Afghanistan, Tunisia, and Morocco were planting sample wheat seeds in the effort to solve their own hunger crises. In 1974, only 2 years after President Nixon's historic meetings in China, Norman Borlaug was sent on an agricultural exchange mission. Borlaug's technology had preceded him. China had already received test packets of Mexican seed through Pakistan and later purchased 5,000 tons of the high-yielding wheat. This success also instigated similar boosts in other crops. IR-8, the new miracle rice, was produced at the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines. Like the hybrid wheats, this rice was short-strawed and able to stand erect when well fertilized. The new rice more than doubled production, and the Philippines exported not only the grain, but also the technology. The Green Revolution preserved millions of acres of forests and wildlife habitats. In 1960, the world produced 692 million tons of grain. 4 decades later, it was almost 2 billion tons, a 3-fold increase, utilizing the same amount of land. If we did not have Borlaug's technology, farmers could not produce the amount of food the world requires today without further encroaching on the rainforests and other sensitive ecosystems.
I call upon you, Norman Ernest Borlaug, to come to the rostrum and receive the diploma and the gold medal of the Nobel Peace Prize for 1970.
Obviously, I am personally honored beyond all dreams by this election, but the obligations imposed by the honors are far greater than the honor itself.
Borlaug continued working to develop the most productive wheat varieties to meet the needs of the exponentially increasing global population. He never expected any personal acknowledgement, let alone the Nobel Peace Prize and the numerous high honors that followed. In 1984, Borlaug received a call from Japanese philanthropist Ryoichi Sasakawa. He asked Borlaug to help him bring the Green Revolution to Africa. Borlaug, who at 70 wanted to be semi-retired, said he was too old to undertake a new continent. The next morning, Sasakawa called again and said, "I'm 15 years older than you. We should have started this project yesterday, but let's start tomorrow." Borlaug was shocked by the devastating malnutrition he witnessed when he was escorted to a village in Ghana.
It's hard for a person from Western countries to understand this. They have to see it. How would you feel if it were your child? I know how I would feel if it were my child.
Sasakawa, Borlaug, and President Jimmy Carter founded an initiative to promote African agriculture. Not only did Borlaug want to produce the highest yielding crops, it was essential for them to be as nutritious as possible. CIMMYT, which had been Borlaug's headquarters in Mexico for many years, scientists developed a high-protein corn hybrid called Quality Protein Maize, which had the potential to prevent malnutrition disorders. But the countries that needed it most were reluctant to try something new. Every spring, when the wheat is ready for harvest, Norman Borlaug still returns to his beloved fields at Obregon. At the age of 95, he goes into the fields to inspect the latest crossings and offer his advice to the current crop of students and wheat breeders. The young farmers and the old friends welcome him like the returning hero he is. His sturdy, high-yielding wheats have made this once destitute valley prosperous. While Borlaug's enormous achievements in saving untold millions of lives from starvation have put him at the level of those people who have changed the course of history, he feels he will not have any lasting legacy unless his successors develop more tools and new technologies to feed the constantly escalating population on a planet with dwindling resources. Today, one of the major threats to the worldwide food supply is a new race of wheat rust, which started in East Africa and travels in the jet streams, recognizing no political boundaries. Dr. Ronnie Kaufman, who was a student in the field the day Borlaug heard he won the Nobel Peace Prize, is now leading the Borlaug Global Rust Initiative. Borlaug, who spearheaded the development of the first rust-resistant wheats, helped pull together this latest worldwide program, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He insisted on being present for the announcement of the project in his beloved Yaqui Valley fields.
When you look at the places in the world now in violence, because the society, the economy was so broken down by famine, by extreme poverty, if we let these problems fester because we think that's not our problem, we end up with a wholly unstable world. We can't afford to let these problems continue to expand the way we've been doing so. We have to address them. We're going to find it's the biggest bargain on the planet.
And nowadays, with globalization, these formerly completely isolated villagers who didn't know anything further than 5 miles away, they now have an ability to see what goes on in the rest of the world. And they see the rich world living like kings when they're still starving to death. It breeds within them an animosity against people who are better off than they are, who refuse to help.
It's absolutely possible.
Every prize gave Norman Borlaug another platform to deliver his message. At age 92, he won the Congressional Gold Medal.
For hunger and poverty and misery are very fertile soils into which to plant all kinds of isms, including terrorism. I thank you very much for the support that you have all given, and especially in that critical period of the 60s when the world said nothing can be done. Look what happened. Thank you.
All of these people who are part of our staff here at the present time are the people who have made most of the contributions.
Well, I say that if I have done something, it's been a leader of a team, and I couldn't have done anything alone. Those who were my students who passed this on. This is an ongoing thing. When I was born, was about 1.6 billion people. Today it's about 6.6 billion, but it's still increasing at about 83 or 84 million more each year. This has to be changed. If the people of the affluent nations want to hope to have tranquility and peace for their children and grandchildren, it won't be based on human misery and poverty, starting with hunger, lack of education, lack of medical service. And my belief is that in the game of baseball, you've got to go in with the spirit of will to win, not with defeatism. And so it is with the biggest and most important game of all, the game of life.